It was September of last year, and Aisha Begum was inside a makeshift shelter of bamboo and plastic sheets, cradling her 1-year-old son in her arms. She and her family had arrived at the refugee camp after their village had been attacked just 2 weeks prior. 2 of her sisters-in-law had died during the 8-day walk to the camp. Now, the 20-year-old woman sat on a mat in the shelter as she was surrounded by her family and told the journalist her story. Throughout the southeast corner of Bangladesh, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children are in refugee camps just like this one, with limited access to food, clean water, and medical supplies. Most have lost family members, many are newly orphaned children, all have suffered unbelievable atrocities. These people are the Rohingya people of Myanmar. In 2009, a UN spokeswoman described the Rohingya as probably the most friendless people in the world, and after you hear their stories, it's easy to understand why. They are an ethnic group of over 1 million from West Myanmar that has faced persecution throughout history, but within the last year has faced a new wave of violence that resulted in over 700,000 Rohingya people fleeing the country. This violence, carried out by the Myanmar military and ignored by the government, has resulted in an estimated death toll of over 10,000, countless villages burned, and abhorrent levels of military-sanctioned violence. The stories that have come out of these refugee camps are appalling and disturbing. Almost all women and girls had experienced sexual violence at the hands of Myanmar soldiers. Men and boys had been lined up and shot dead, and even infants were torn from the arms of their mothers and killed. Those that survived had to flee their villages, crossing the border into Bangladesh or boarding small ships to sail to other countries in Southeast Asia. Forced to abandon their homes, they desperately sought refuge anywhere they could, but many found that the other countries would refuse to accept them, turning their boats away from their shores. Now, hundreds of thousands of Rohingya people have fled Myanmar, most ending up in the refugee camps of Bangladesh. But even those who have found refuge now must endure unsanitary conditions at the overcrowded and undersupplied camps, all while their future and safety remains in limbo, especially as recent talks between Bangladesh and Myanmar include plans to send these refugees back. The story of the Rohingya people is one laced with persecution and tragedy. Their presence in Myanmar can be traced back to the 8th century, when they arrived in the western state of Rakhine from elsewhere in Asia. After Myanmar, which was then known as Burma, won independence from the British in 1945, the British had promised an independent state for the Rohingya people, but never followed through. The institutionalized persecution of the Rohingya began in 1948 with the Citizenship Act, which did not include the Rohingya as one of the 135 ethnicities native to Myanmar. Then, in 1962, the military and the Burma Socialist Program Party staged a coup overthrowing the government, and it resulted in a huge increase of the power of the military, even over that of the government. Suspicions over the origins of the Rohingya people began as false claims surfaced that the Rohingya people actually first arrived in Myanmar during British colonial rule from Bangladesh. The government declared in 1982 that the Rohingya were illegal immigrants and stripped them of all citizenship, rendering them stateless. Today, the Myanmar government still refuses to call the Rohingya people Rohingya, instead calling them Bengalis. Furthermore, the Rohingya are majority Muslim, while the rest of the country is almost 90% Buddhist. For years, state leaders of Myanmar have fueled fears that Islam would take over the country, wiping away Buddhist history and culture. Feelings of distrust towards the Rohingya people were heightened further in recent years due to violence committed by some Rohingya groups against the military. This even prompted the government to declare that all Rohingya people were terrorists. These ethnically, religiously, and politically motivated sentiments of distrust and hatred exploded around August of 2017 with attempts of the Myanmar military to rid the country of the Rohingya through fear, violence, and mass killings. This level of military-sanctioned violence can only be described as ethnic cleansing and genocide. These are not terms that are thrown around lightly by world governments or the United Nations. But in September of 2016, the UN declared that these acts of violence were clearly ethnic cleansing, and the U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson soon followed suit. Unfortunately, since the start of the genocide, much of the world has felt powerless to help. The the UN has had little effect since the UN Refugee Agency is forbidden from entering the country, which causes them to believe that the violence could still be ongoing. The government also forbids any humanitarian aid groups or news groups from entering the country, claiming that they're assisting Rohingya terrorist groups. The government of Myanmar itself has completely denied that these acts of ethnic cleansing ever occurred, calling the stories of the survivors lies. State councilor and de facto leader of Myanmar, Suu Kyi, has labeled the stories of ethnic cleansing fake news, and she has even specifically attacked female survivors of sexual violence, calling their stories fake rape. Satellite images show how the military has bulldozed over villages and burned the bodies of those they killed in mass graves, all to cover evidence of the ethnic cleansing. It appears that the government and military of Myanmar is making a concerted effort to brush the suffering of the Rohingya people under the rug and escape with as little backlash from the rest of the world as possible. Most recently, the states of Bangladesh and Myanmar have entered agreements to begin returning Rohingya people back to the western state of Rakhine, even by force if necessary. They plan to do so without any guarantee of the people's safety, no increased rights for the Rohingya people, including citizenship, no acknowledgement that ethnic cleansing occurred, and no plans to punish or even just remove the military officials that ordered these atrocities carried out. The military leaders, particularly General An Min Hwang, can and should be tried by an international court for their crimes against humanity, but no world power has taken any steps to make this happen. Now, this entire situation begs the question, what should the world do? Or even, what can the world do? Given recent developments, the world cannot afford to be a bystander as hundreds of thousands of Rohingya people are sent back to a life of violence, persecution, and discrimination. Currently, the only foreign involvement in these talks is that of British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, who has visited refugee camps and, with the support of his government, is urging Suu Kyi to do all she can to protect Rohingya refugees. Furthermore, the UK Prime Minister Theresa May has also called on Myanmar to accept full responsibility for the ethnic cleansing. But how can the world power ensure that Myanmar will do so or punish any of their generals, especially considering that they're denying that the ethnic cleansing even occurred? The only way to force the nation to accept blame and begin holding any officials accountable is through economic action, specifically mass international sanctions. The U.S. did put targeted sanctions against certain Myanmar officials in December of 2017, but in this case, the only effective sanctions would have to be comprehensive sanctions. As opposed to those in place now, comprehensive sanctions target an entire country and include trade embargoes, asset freezes, and other financial restrictions intended to inflict economic losses. Such sanctions have actually been placed on Myanmar from 2003 to 2016, but in response, the country simply began importing goods from Japan and South Korea and other places. Therefore, not only would these sanctions have to target the entire country, but there would have to be a mass international cooperation between several world powers in order for Myanmar to begin suffering financially. The world should make clear that these sanctions would remain in place until Myanmar holds their military officials accountable for their crimes, begins to allow humanitarian aid groups into their country to both assist the Rohingya refugees and to observe whether the violence is still ongoing, and to agree to not force any Rohingya people back into the country. The next question, though, the one likely highest in all of our minds, is what can we do? We probably assume not a lot, considering the scale of this issue, but I'd say you're underestimating our power as the people of a nation. The first thing we can do is give what we can and help the many humanitarian aid groups working in Bangladesh to assist refugees. There are many such organizations that could use our help, such as Action Against Hunger, which is distributing food and water to refugees in Bangladesh, as well as counseling trauma victims. Another is UNICEF, which is not only distributing shelter, food, and water, but also works to protect female and child refugees and has plans to begin vaccinating children. The group Save the Children also works to protect child refugees, especially orphans or those separated accompanied children, the elderly, and trauma survivors. All these groups accept donations, which are desperately needed, especially as more makeshift camps spring up to accommodate the growing number of displaced Rohingya. I urge you to research these organizations on your own and share their information with everyone you can. They desperately need our help, as do the Rohingya people. The last, simplest, and possibly most valuable thing that we can all do is to spread awareness of this issue. Too many people in the United States and in the world are completely ignorant of this topic. We don't see it in the news. Congressmen aren't arguing over it in Washington. You likely do not know one person personally and directly affected by this issue. But that doesn't mean it isn't happening. It is still happening to real people. It doesn't matter that they're on the other side of the world. It doesn't matter that they don't speak our language and are from another country. People are people, violence is violence, and genocide is equal. Every day that we allow this to continue anywhere in the world grows weaker and humanity carries the blame. The world cannot afford to be desensitized to genocide, or more such atrocities will occur more often. We must spread the stories of the Rohingya people far and wide and never forget them. As the Holocaust survivor and hero of oppressed peoples, Elie Wiesel has said, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest." I hope that you carry these words with you as you move forward, because even if our representatives, our governments, choose to do nothing, we must not forget. We must never forget the stories of the hundreds of thousands of Rohingya men, women, and children who suffered unimaginable injustices. We must, because they are real people, just like you and I, and they deserve to know that the world cares about them. Thank you for listening.